Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Keepsake box series, which has been kindly sponsored by Axminster Tools. In this particular video, we are going to be cutting, transferring and fitting the Mitred Dovetails for the corner of this box. As a quick reminder, in the description below you'll find links to the project packs, all the tools I'm using, plans and various resources that may be useful to you at this stage of the build. Let's get stuck into it. Okay, so we've got the dovetails up in the vise at the moment, and for this first one, we're just going to focus on the fundamentals of sawing again. So to start with, we want to make sure that the cut across the end grain here is perfectly square. If it's off at an angle, like this, then we're going to have trouble when assembling the joint. And so our first port of call should be getting that cut square. Once we've done that, we can kind of focus on the actual pitch of the dovetail afterwards. Now the way I do this is place my thumb on the back corner like that, just to give the saw a little bit of support from the side, but not pushing into it to the extent where you start bending the plate. So we'll just get it resting there. You can kind of roll your thumb forwards and backwards to give you the, is it lateral location you need. And in this case, we're trying to place the saw so it cuts just on the waist side. So just next to the line, right about there. If we miss it in this stage, it doesn't really matter too much, but when it comes to cutting the pins, that's where we want to be pretty accurate. So with Japanese saws, they cut on the pull stroke, so we'll just pull it back with very light pressure. And I'm just cutting the back edge for the time being to get the saw plate located in it. Once I've done that, as we did in the last part, we're just going to cut and slowly lower the saw, tracking the line from back to front, which will then get it locked in the end grain at a very shallow depth, which gives us a little bit of extra wiggle room so we can work on the pitch of the dovetail afterwards. So just small cuts with the saw, slowly lowering it, blowing away the dust. And now that's locked into the end grain in a very shallow curve. And because it's shallow, we can now tilt the saw plate to match the pitch of that dovetail, which effectively breaks this cutting stage down into 2 parts. So once I'm happy with my angle, we'll switch to doing long strokes with the saw and slowly work down to that baseline. And while I'm doing this, I'm holding the saw incredibly lightly. I could probably almost hold it with my thumb and index finger and just let the saw do the work. A little bit hard to control, but it's a good demonstration of how little pressure you need with these saws. They are so incredibly sharp. Okay, and then as for these outer sections, it's very much the same process, except instead of following a dovetail pitch, we're just going to be cutting plumb. Ideally, with this, there will be a little bit of material left over in the groove that we can use later on. It will make a bit more sense when you actually see it. But in this case, we've got breakout here that is gonna basically break that material away and I won't be able to maintain it. Like I say, I'll show you the knock-on effects of this later on, but if you can maintain a little tab of material on the left-hand side of the groove in this case, then try and do so. But for me, I'm just gonna have to basically remove it. But we'll start from back to front like we have done before, get the saw locked in the end grain and then just focus on cutting straight down. This side on the other hand will be slightly different. You'll see that I will be able to maintain that tab and you'll see the use case for it later on. So again, get it located along the end grain, make sure my saw is angled to be cutting plumb, and then long strokes down to the baseline. Okay, so with the tails cut, next we need to remove the waste between them, and we're going to do so with a coping saw. In regards to coping saws, there's a couple of things you should take note of when you buy one of them. Firstly, the blade that's in them, just take it out and throw it away. It's rubbish. It always is, and it will bend and deflect and probably snap before you even get any decent cut out of it. When it comes to installing the new blades, links to which I'll put in the description below, make sure you install them where they cut on the pull stroke. Much like a Japanese saw, coping saws work much better this way. Because if they cut on the push stroke, what happens is it detensions the frame, you lose tension on the blade, and then that is what causes a lot of breakages and inaccuracies when using these tools. Now generally you'll see me using a fret saw to remove material like this because it gets down into these thin curves much easier than a thicker coping saw blade like this. But because we're doing this with a somewhat affordable tool set, I did want to prove that it is still possible to get through these Japanese saw curves with a thicker blade like a coping saw that doesn't really get down that easily. The key to it is doing long, smooth movements with the saw, working down the kerf and not trying to make that turn too quickly at the bottom. So with regards to this bit of waste here, let's get the coping saw sort of working down. And when we get to around about, I don't know, what's that, 2/3 or so, that's where we'll start turning it. But I'm going to focus most of my effort on doing long strokes and then turning it very subtly. Where people go wrong with this is they try and make the turn straight away with the saw, which obviously bends the blade, and there's no way I'm moving that back and forth anymore. If you focus on the strokes first and then very slightly turn it as you do, you can make that turn pretty easy. It just all comes down to using long strokes like this. And if you need to, you can then go back on yourself to finish off any of the corners. Okay, so now's a good time to kind of step back and check your progress with things and see how you've got on with this stage. The most important thing at this step is making sure the end grain at the top of the dovetails has been cut square. If you've veered off from any of these angles on the dovetails, you know, maybe the angle's too steep or maybe it's too shallow, it doesn't actually matter because we're going to be tracing around these tails anyway when it comes to cutting the sockets. One of the other really important things at this stage is don't be tempted to rough cut these miters just yet, because when it comes to transferring these to the sockets, these square edges on the back are going to be incredibly beneficial to us. And if we miter them now, we're not going to have anything to knife against. So I'd always recommend working systematically with this. And so before we go ahead and start chiseling these baselines, I'm going to get the 3 remaining corners to this stage. Okay, so with the tails all cut out, in the spirit of doing everything systematically, next we're going to go along and chisel all of these baselines. So to do this, we're going to get ourselves in a position that's nice and comfy and we can sight along the baseline. The reason we put ourselves in a position that allows us to do this is because when we're chiseling, we can easily see if we're cutting down vertical. If, however, we're sitting in a position where we're looking along the piece of wood and the marking gauge line is horizontal to our field of view, we can see this angle that we're chiseling, but we can't see this one, which is the most important in this case because we want to make sure we're cutting plumb. Now, in order to do this, I'm using the Axminster Ryder bevel edge chisels, which I've been an advocate for some time. For the money, they're very, very good. They're good quality steel. They've got nice wooden handles on them that are comfortable to grip. And most importantly, the bevels on the edge come down to not a razor sharp point like you'd find on the Veritas bench chisels, but a small enough flat spot that you can get into corners of dovetails without bruising them. The flat spot is actually about the same size as the Lie-Nielsen chisels that are up on the premium end of woodworking chisels. So I very much like them, but with those flat spots, you still have got to be somewhat careful. Now, the general rule of chiseling is this: keep halving the waste material until you can't halve it anymore, and then you can commit to chopping into that baseline that we've scratched in with the marking gauge. But before we do that, let's just double check to ensure that the saw cuts have actually reached the baseline. This is the back of the component, and I can see that there's a few bits that haven't quite got there. So I'm just going to finish those off with the chisel. You can see I'm holding it very close to the tip here to ensure I don't slip and accidentally stab my other finger. There we go, that'll finish those off nicely. And we'll put the chisel halfway in that waste material, and we're going to chop halfway down into the material before flipping it over and working from the other side. And so I'm sighting along it at the moment from the same direction as you to ensure that we are cutting plumb. And I'll stop about halfway. Just get rid of that little flaky bit that's left next to it. And then we'll halve the material again. And then I think that's about as close as we'll get to the baseline before we can commit to it. So let's just put the chisel into the mark now and just do small taps until we hear that sound change. There we go. So when doing this, I've picked a chisel that obviously fits within the tails, but is able to do as much of the socket as possible in one chop. I could use a smaller chisel for this, but if you do that, you're much more likely to get a choppier baseline. And so pick the widest chisel you possibly can when chopping out these sockets, and you will get the best results from doing so. Now, as for getting into these corners, obviously we need to account for these small flat spots up the side of the chisel. And so when you do this, just slightly angle it away from those walls and then carefully pare it through, being careful not to bruise them. You can also do this in the vise. It might give you a bit more control, but I'm happy doing it vertical like this. So then we'll work on the one next to it. Again, just finish it off, getting down to those baselines. Get the chisel halfway in the material, chop down to halfway, halve it again, and then put it in the middle of the baseline, chop down to halfway, and then slightly angle it to clear out those corners. All right, then flip it over, and we'll work from the other side doing exactly the same thing. So to finish these off, what I like to do is get the tails up in the vise and just finish off any of the corners with a small chisel, just getting rid of any frilly bits that have been left over. Okay, so with all of the tails now chiseled out, we're going to move on to transferring these tails to the pin boards. Again, let's do this systematically. We'll work through these one at a time, make sure they're all been transferred, and then double check we've transferred them in the correct direction to ensure we don't end up with one of those S-shaped boxes I showed you in part 1. So seeing as these are all numbered, we might as well go through them in numerical order. So we'll start with number 1, and I'm just going to use one of the spare boards behind this in order to support the tail board from behind. So we've got number 1 here, upright in the vise, and the face edge is on the left-hand side here. So I usually get this sort of poking slightly above the supporting block behind, and just make sure that that's sitting evenly in the vise and you've got an even sort of step on either side. If not, you can always get a mallet and just tap it ever so slightly to make sure it is sitting even. Because if there's a bit of a wonk on it, when you come to transfer the tails onto it, you've got more of a chance of it sort of tipping like this. And then once we're happy it's sort of sitting securely on there, get some sort of flat material to line up those two face edges with one another. And then if you have means of doing so, you could also clamp it down in place. And in fact, this one is quite a good example as to why we wanted to maintain that little tab next to the groove, as opposed to removing it straight away. Because obviously with this one, we've got a nice wall that we can knife against when transferring the tails to the pins. However, this one, we are lacking it. And if we'd gone ahead and pre-cut these miters on the edges, we'd have had exactly the same problem here, but to an even worse extent, which is why it's really important we kept these square until after we'd done this transferring process. Fortunately, this is actually one of the benefits of having one of these knives with a flat back on them, which, if I'm brutally honest, is something that can't be said for my own marking knives that we produce. You know, I absolutely love using these things for getting into tight spaces, but when it comes to things like this, where you haven't got a proper line to reference against, these blades that come with my knives are actually not that good, and you actually need something like this with the flat back in order to reference against the material we do have and sort of bridge that gap onto the material below. So if you do find yourself in this situation and you are using a scalpel blade of some sort and you're not able to bridge that gap without accidentally undercutting, the other thing you could use here is a chisel. Just reference that on the surface above and then carefully lower it down, ensuring that you're making contact with that entire surface, and then mark that onto the pins. But seeing as we've got a nice knife with a flat back on it, we don't need to worry about doing this. Be careful not to put too much pressure down when doing this, because it's very easy to push the tails out of alignment. It's better to make your marks more prominent by using successive passes rather than one big deep one all at once. And before we do anything, we'll just make sure to mark the waist and ensure we don't accidentally cut out the wrong areas when it comes to cutting these later on. But again, we're going to hold off on that for the time being. We'll do all of this transferring before making a single cut. Okay, so with them all transferred on top, next we're going to scribe the lines joining that top line down to the baseline, and do so using a knife and an engineer's square. If you've accidentally drawn two lines on the top, perhaps the first one was inaccurate and you needed to do a second one, now is your opportunity to indicate which of the lines you should be following when it comes to cutting these out. So to do that, I'm just going to lay the dovetails on top, and it becomes fairly apparent at this stage which are the accurate lines and which are the inaccurate lines. And once I know, I'll just put a little mark on which line I should be following, and then square that down to the baseline. So I've actually got two on this board because of a slip of a knife, but the second one is on the mitre here, and we don't actually need to scratch a line down the front on this mitre because we're not going to be cutting it. However, on the back, we will be cutting it. Again, this is sort of hard to explain at this point, but it will make sense later on. So once I'm happy the incorrect lines have been correctly indicated, we'll just finish off the rest of them by knifing down to the baseline. And on these pin boards, although we may not see them when sawing, we may end up utilising them when it comes to chiselling, and so it's worth knifing these on the front and the back. Okay, so the tails have now been transferred to the pin boards, and we can go ahead and begin cutting these out. Now this is going to follow very much the same process as the tails. We're going to establish the end grain first, and then once doing so, we'll focus on cutting plumb. As before, remember there is a bunch of resources in the description below if you're struggling with any part of this, whether it's the transferring itself, whether it's chiseling, whether it's sawing. There's so much down there. Just have a look if there's any particular skill you're struggling with. I can guarantee there'll be something there for you. So as before, we'll use our thumb or finger, whatever you're comfortable with, in order to locate the saw on one side. And just by rolling it back and forth, that will give us our sort of lateral movement we require. And remember, we're aiming to cut on the waist side of the line, but still right up against the line. If you're not particularly comfortable with doing this, I'll show you a method in which you can cut slightly away from it and chisel back to it. It's not quite as straightforward as you'd hope it would be, but this is certainly one of those things where you just want to practice your sawing skills and get it so you can do this reliably, because chiseling can be a bit of a faff. So we're starting on the back edge, blowing away the dust, tracking the line from back to front. And by the way, when you do this, you absolutely can track it from front to back if you find that easier. It's pretty much the same process, just whatever you're comfortable with. But once we've established that's where we want the line to be, we can sort of angle the saw in order to ensure that we're cutting plumb, and then focus on nice long movements going down to the baseline. Oh, and one key point to remember when cutting these out is only to cut out these three sockets. Don't go ahead and try and cut these mitres out just yet, and especially don't cut down this front edge. This entire section here to the right hand side of this socket needs to be kept, because we're actually going to be cutting this from the back like so, which will maintain this front face while removing the material behind the mitre. Right, so as promised, I've left one of the saw cuts about 1 millimeter away from the line here. But instead of fixing that now, I actually find it easier to work on the baseline first and then come back to this. However, what I will say now is there's not really any excuse from going away from the line more than 1 millimeter. When I show people this chiseling technique, sometimes they end up cutting like 3 or 5 millimeters away. And by that point, it becomes so much work to apply some of the chiseling techniques I'm going to show you later that you could have just cut this close to start with. So work on your confidence cutting as close to the line as possible. And like realistically, if you do go over it ever so slightly, don't worry. I'll be showing you techniques later in the series to fix that. And at the end of the day, it's just a bit of wood. It doesn't matter. It's not the end of the world if you cut beyond where you're supposed to. We'll do what we can later to fix it, and and in subsequent projects, you'll be able to improve on these skills. Right, so when it comes to chiseling out these sockets, it's very much the same process as the tails that we've already done. You're just going to keep halving the material until you can't halve it anymore, and then commit to chopping into that final shoulder line. There is an exception with these pins, however, in that with this larger socket, we need to ensure that there is absolutely zero breakout in the bottom of it when we chop in from both sides and meet in the middle with a chisel. It's quite a common thing that happens happens, and most of the time you can get away with it. But because in this case we're going to be separating the lid, hence why we've made this socket slightly bigger, the bottom of this joint basically becomes an exposed face, and if you've got any tear out in there, that is going to become exposed upon separation of the lid. So what I'd advise is go ahead and just chop these two smaller ones as normal. And obviously when you're chopping down, just be aware that you're going to need to slightly match the pitch of the pin walls as you descend. When it comes to this larger one, I'll show you the technique of dealing with this in a bit. Now, because we're following the same principles as before, we obviously want to make sure we pick a chisel that's able to do the majority of the socket in one hit to ensure we don't get a choppy line. So in this case, I'm using a 16mm chisel, which is about 5/8 of an inch. But one little neat trick you can do with this to avoid having to sharpen this chisel, you know, more than you want to. Instead, what you can do is pick up a smaller chisel to hog out the majority of the waste and then do the final chopping with this wider one. This will ensure your baseline remains nice and straight and will make the sharpness of this chisel go much further. So I'll just go through these ones now with the 6mm chisel. Just go along and halve the material all the way along. And because we're removing less material, because it's a smaller chisel, it's actually much easier to chop as well. You'll see when you go to the wider chisels, like the 16mm, it's actually harder to remove material because the cut is much wider. There you go, so you can see there, I've cut pretty damn close to the lines. We've just got one chop that's remaining to get back to them. So we'll reach for our nice wide, freshly sharpened chisel, pop that in the line, and then just tap it down vertical. And then we could probably just choke up on the chisel and pare these corners down. And there we go. That leaves us with a nice straight line on this top edge, and our chisel sharpness has been preserved. All right, so that is the two smaller sockets accounted for. Next, we're going to move on to this larger one that requires a little bit of special attention. Because obviously with these two other sockets, we have got a little bit of breakout in the middle, which is a very common thing when you chisel in from both sides of a piece of wood. It's going to happen whether you chisel in perpendicular or if you slightly undercut it. It's pretty much unavoidable, but again, it's all hidden by the joint when it's assembled. With this one, we don't have that flexibility, so we need to make sure the bottom of this is perfectly flat and clean. And the way we're going to do that is when we chisel into it, instead of going in perpendicular like this or undercutting it like we sometimes do with dovetails, we're actually going to, I guess you would refer to this as overcutting, maybe? I don't quite know. But we're going to chisel like this away from the baselines of the dovetails and do so from both sides, which will result in a very shallow peak in the middle of the joint, which we can then shave away later on. Now you can do the same thing as before by using a smaller chisel to hog out the majority of the waste, just maybe don't take off quite as much material. Because again, we don't want to damage any of the end grain at the bottom of this socket. So there we go. The difference is pretty clear with this larger socket. Obviously there's a bit more work to do on it, but just initially look at the lack of breakout in it compared to these two. Now I was being a little bit heavy-handed when cutting these out, so maybe this amount of breakout is excessive, but the longer you do woodworking, the more you come to understand the things that you can get away with and the things that you can't get away with. And those things that you can't get away with, you end up becoming very good at fixing those problems. And so while being a competent woodworker does come down to skill to some extent, you have also got to factor in those other two things. How good you are at covering your mistakes and how good you are at knowing what mistakes you can get away with and what ones you can't. You know, a lot of my students in the past would have been mortified to see something like this in their dovetails when cutting them for the first time. Little do they know, mine look exactly the same. Anyway, we'll start getting to work at removing this peak now. And this is done with a nice freshly sharpened chisel. And you just carefully pare it away like this. And every now and then we'll just check it with a square to ensure that it's perfectly flat. So yeah, just every now and then get the engineer's square, and we're just looking to see if it's still touching in the middle, or more importantly, if we can see any light appearing under the front or the back shoulder. If you can see light anywhere along here, that shows that there's a bump in the middle and you still got to remove it. We'll just flip it around and work from the other side every now and then. So So yeah, just keep being very careful when you do this, because in the same way we don't want any breakout appearing like in these other sockets, we also don't want any undercut to appear, because again, an undercut will become a gap in the joint once the lid is separated. So now the only other thing to sort out is this wall here, which I didn't cut to with the saw because I wanted to show you the proper chiseling technique for removing this material without just shoving it in the end grain and slamming it with a mallet hoping for the best. Because if you do that, you're going to be at the whim of the grain direction of the piece. And so if I were to put the chisel in the top here, it's going to split in the direction of the grain and it will split into the material that I want to keep, thus giving me a gap. Now that's not to say you can't read the grain direction ahead of time and determine whether you can chop down like this. For example, if it were this one that I needed to chop, I probably could do it vertically, to be honest, because the grain is tracking into the material that I'm going to be removing. And so it might work quite nicely. But again, this technique I'm about to show you will work for both of these situations, but give you guaranteed success in both of them rather than just crossing your fingers for, you know, either of these situations. Now, what I want to be able to do here is put my chisel in this vertical wall and pare backwards. That way, it doesn't matter what the grain direction is, my chisel is going to determine whether that line is cutting square or not, and that is all based on whether this knife line is, of course, square. So that's why your marking out matters. And while I could just start pushing this chisel through, what I will eventually face is a kind of pinching on the bottom of the chisel where the bottom of the material that I'm trying to remove is pinching because it's still technically attached to the rest of the board. This will make the chisel harder to push through, which will make me push harder on the chisel, and then something is eventually going to give. It will be the wood, but you're going to have so much force behind it that you'll eventually slip and probably cause breakout on the back edge. Long story short, the way to deal with this is to simply sever the material at the bottom of the wall first. You can do this with a marking knife, you can do it with a chisel, you can do it with whatever really. But if we just do a few slices there, now when I put my chisel into this line, make sure it's located from top to bottom, and then I can swing it round to match the angle of the pin wall, and then carefully just sort of wiggle it up and down and push it through like that. If you're worried for whatever reason about it splitting on the end grain here, you can put your chisel into it like so, and just give it a tiny tap like that just to separate the material, and then continue with what you're doing. And you want to go to about halfway here. You see how easy that's peeling away at the bottom there? And then you can just give it a twist and it breaks straight off. This is now perfectly square. It matches the line on the front, it matches the line on the top. We can just do the same from the back now. There we go, just a bit of cleanup to do in these corners. And that is a perfect pin wall. And you can do that with any excess material that you identify on either side of the pins. If it's really, really close to the line and you think you just need to take away a slither of material to sort of get back to it, I would advise holding off on doing that until it actually comes to fitting the dovetails, because you might find that you actually need that excess material to fill a gap. But in the case of this one that I just showed you, where it was, you know, like a millimeter away, I'm pretty confident that that material would have intruded on the joint when I was trying to assemble it and it had to be removed. So yeah, don't go too mental with it at this stage. So the only thing that is now preventing us from test fitting these joints are the miters on either side. So let's get cutting these out. So the order in which we do this doesn't really matter because we're going to be cutting away from the lines and chiseling back to them later. The only thing to warn you against is when cutting the tails, it's very common, for me at least, for the saw to drop and cut into the tail below. So if you've got any sort of material, in fact, I might just shove a bit of cardboard on there. Honestly, I do this all the time. It's definitely worth doing. So I'm cutting about a millimeter away. If that, to be honest, you just want to get it as close as you possibly can. That was genius. I've never actually thought of doing that before, and that is probably the first time I haven't cut into a tail. Okay, and then as for the pins, again, we're only going to cut a millimeter away from the line. Just don't let your concentration lapse here, because on the top, I can see that that's a bit of waste material I need to remove, but I don't want to be cutting into it perpendicular like that, because obviously the material on the face we want to keep. I want to be cutting up at an angle like this and keeping a little bit of distance between my saw and that line. So there we go, I've stopped it just shy of the back edge. So now we'll cut the mitre off. Bit of distance between my saw and the line again. And just be very careful not to cut into the pin that we want to keep. So there we go, a little bit of cleanup to do all round, but that's exactly where we want to be for this stage. That's the miters of the dovetails now cut. So next we are going to start chiseling back to them using a pairing jig. Now, the reason we're going to use a pairing jig is just because it gives us a bit more control and it allows us to cut with the grain along these miters, which gives us a smoother, sometimes more controlled finish. Because while we could probably just do this by eye, using a pairing jig just gives you a bit more control. However, you do have to go through the time expense of making the jig itself. But again, this is quite simple. For this, we're going to be bringing out our old trusty friend, the shooting board, and we're going to be converting it into a mitre shooting board with the addition of a 45-degree fence. And the way to do this is pretty simple. And by the way, it's probably worth making a dedicated shooting board for this rather than adapting a pre-existing one like I'm doing here. I'm just being lazy. So to start with, just pick a point anywhere along this long straight edge. I'm going to do so like an inch back from the fence, but it doesn't really matter. And then measure from that point a length of some predetermined amount. For me, I'm going to do 100 millimeters, which is about 4 inches. And then from that second line, just square it back. So I can measure back 100 mil and then give myself a little, bloody pencils, give myself a little mark at the end. So now we've got two lines at perfect right angles to each other that are 100 millimeters from the corner that they both join. And so if we go ahead and connect these 2 points, that's going to give us a 45-degree line that we can stick a fence of some sort to. So I'm just going to super glue it down again and then hope that I can break it off later. Then I've made sure to leave a little corner of this fence exposed so that I can plane it back, which will help give the mitre thing that I'm going to shoot here a little bit of support from behind. So there we go, with that stuck down, we can just get rid of that little bit that's left. And there we go, that's perfectly flush. Now in theory, we can get a block of wood on here and plane an angle onto it. But of course, I might as well just rough cut that first. I'll literally just eyeball this because the plane will do most of it. Look at those sawing skills. Ugh. I've made that way more difficult for myself than I should have, but never mind, I'll stick with it. So the reason I've picked this block to become the mitre pairing surface is because it's given me a nice reference surface for the chisel. You don't want to be using something that's like a little pencil to rest the chisel on, because the smaller the reference surface you have, the more chance you have of wobble with the chisel. So you see these last few strokes, I'm just making sure I'm going through with one controlled cut to ensure there's no steps or anything in that mitre. And that's looking good. All right, and then we can start thinking about clamping this all in situ, ready for pairing. The only thing I would say is if your bench is slightly choppy like mine, there's a chance that when you pair through this mitre, you could be located above a dip and that back edge isn't going to be fully supported. So I'd probably recommend getting a bit of MDF or plywood or something that you know is dead flat to act as a nice solid backstop for that fragile corner. And one more thing to be aware of with this when you're clamping it down is ensure that your chisel is able to clear the clamp head here, especially when you get towards the bottom. There is a chance of the handle hitting it up here and then it slightly elevating the chisel and taking a nice big chunk out. So I'm quite happy with that. It's all lined up nicely with the shoulder line. So we'll just get the chisel referenced on that jig and carefully push it through. So that's good. We got a fair bit of the material there. We'll just move this jig back ever so slightly. And I'm always making sure it stays flush on this long edge here, because if it's off at an angle like that, you're going to add some sort of weird angle onto the mitre and, you know, just get some sort of compound thing going on, which wouldn't be great. You can see when I'm doing this, most of my pressure is on the chisel here. I'm not really grabbing the handle and trying to push it through. I'm just trying to keep it seated on this jig as much as I can. There we go. that little bit there. And then because we have a tiny bit of material to remove on the end grain here, like I did with that pin socket I showed you earlier, if we just go along now with the chisel and just slightly sever that grain on the wall, again, that'll make it easier to remove later. We could also do this with a knife. Okay, and then as for these walls, we'll just do the same as before. If we put the chisel into that line on the end grain, and we probably just give it a few wiggles just to sort of separate the material up there. Then get a knife, sever the grain at the bottom of the wall, and it should just be a case of sort of rolling it forward like this, and you'll just see all of that grain peel away nice and easily. Little twist and it all removes. Then we just got some sort of final clean up to do. And there we go. Right, so it's now time for a cheeky test fit. Let's see how we've got on. Oh, blimey. Bit of a gap on that one. It has been a while, but that is, looks like we're doing a gap repair video at some point. I'm not afraid to show these things. Sometimes you just screw up. But it's fine, we'll make that gap almost invisible by the time it comes to gluing it up. Now, one thing you should note when dry assembling boxes like this, where you've got the tails on the front and the back, is if we were to knock these together like so, and they end up becoming a really tight fit, it's going to be very difficult to knock these joints apart after assembly. And so when testing the joints of this box, either do it one at a time, working sequentially. So I've just tested corner 1 here. Check number 2 next. That's looking a bit better. A few tiny gaps down the front here, but that will get filled when the wood expands due to glue. So we're happy with that. Number 3. Obviously, when you're doing this, just bear in mind those miters are very fragile, so don't go throwing them around the bench like I'm doing now. Oh, is that? Look like there's actually a wall here that I didn't chisel back to. Pretty good. And finally, number 4. Nice. Pretty happy with that. And this is why I love Mitred Dovetails, because not only does that 45-degree angle finish off the top of this joint really nicely, but it also contains the groove within the inside of the box without it showing on any of the outside faces. And there we go, that is the Mitred Dovetails complete. So as a quick summary, don't be too hard on yourself if you get any small gaps and stuff appear at this stage. As you can see, it happens to the best of us. Clearly, I'm going to have to be showing you methods later on in this series on how to fix small gaps like that. Don't forget, there's a ton of resources in the description below if you need them, whether you're struggling with the sawing, the chiseling, the layout of this joint, anything. Most of it can be found down there, so go and have a look if you're struggling before moving on to the next stage. Speaking of which, I'll see you then.